more widespread within the brass community than we often talk about. Other instrument groups have had a easier time and have spent more time sort of talking through, what cumulative fatigue and what, overuse can do to their playing. I think we're still in the early stages of it in the brass world, but nonetheless, it's something that I think is important to think about because it's been something that has been plaguing brass players for a long time. We just haven't put together any really true protocols as to like how to deal with things.
For sure. Before we get into that, one of the questions I was asked a few times was, what's it like to play in the New York Phil?
Oh, okay. So I've played now in I think all the various sort of tiers of orchestras that have played that are in the United States. My first job was with the San Antonio Symphony, which is what would be considered sort of a smaller orchestra, one that is recently restarted. Then I played for 12 years in the Atlanta Symphony, which is sort of a large budget mid-tier orchestra. And then you have New York Philharmonic, it's considered one of the largest budget orchestras in the U.S. And I think there's some things that are really that have been very consistent all the way up and down, whether it's New York Philharmonic, Atlanta Symphony, or San Antonio Symphony, which has been that all the sections I've been a part of have cared very deeply and intensely about what we're doing on stage, really tried very hard to provide the absolute best level of playing that we can. We used to get together in San Antonio and do little sectionals just sort of at the rehearsal breaks or before, or stick around just a little bit later to get some stuff done. And that continued all the way through to Atlanta and to New York. We still try very hard to make sure that we're as together and as the absolute best that we can be. And I think that's something that is sometimes overlooked in terms of the way that we look from the outside into the orchestra scene, is that there's incredible playing that's going on in every orchestra, and all the trombone players that I know that I've played with many orchestras over the years and through the country, that there is a tremendous amount of personal integrity and care with which we approach the job. Now, when it comes to New York Philharmonic, one of the things about it, because it is a large institution, it's one that is in an incredible, like a big cultural hotspot. It's an orchestra that goes on tour. It's a place where people, as they sort of are working their way through the scene, very often decide to stop and stay. So that's one of the things that I notice a lot in the New York Philharmonic, is that we have much more stability. We have fewer people sort of coming in and out for other jobs compared to some of the other orchestras that I've been a part of. And the thing I really love about the New York Philharmonic is that everyone in the orchestra is extremely passionate about what we do. It's an incredible institution to be a part of. It has an incredible history. It's the oldest orchestra in the United States. It's had music directors. Gustav Mahler was a music director of the New York Philharmonic at one point. There have been some incredible. Leonard Bernstein and now in the future Gustavo Dudamel. We have the opportunity to work with some of the very, very best on a more consistent basis than I maybe saw in some of the other orchestras that I've been a part of, just because of the size of the budget and the convenience of getting to New York. So I don't know. I think being a part of the New York Philharmonic, it's an amazing thing. Every concert has something incredible to offer. I get to listen to, some incredible colleagues, and I'm inspired on a regular basis. And the flip side of that is that you have to be on all the time. There's no, there's no doubt there. There's no the level that's expected of you is very, very high. And there's because we do very few pops shows. We don't do any pop shows. We just do some movie shows and occasionally do like a Broadway thing over the summer. It's the intensity is high. It's a high sustained level of intensity, and I think that being a part of an orchestra like that, it does take a certain amount of being ready to withstand that kind of scrutiny and that kind of intensity. But if you're someone who thrives on that, the sort of testing yourself every night and participating in something that can be just incredibly, transcendent, then it's a good place to work.
Thanks, Colin. So you've been one of the few high-profile, I would argue, musicians to go through an injury. Would you be comfortable sharing what caused that injury?
Yeah, sure. I alluded to it a little bit at the beginning. So brass health. I actually went through a period. I think in October of 2009, I had a partial tear of the orbicularis oris, which is your lip muscle group, specifically sort of on the top right where the rim of the mouthpiece contacts with your lip. I knew something was wrong because when I went to play a note in a concert, actually the first note of Catacombs and Pictures at an Exhibition, I went to play it and it felt like immediately someone had taken like a white hot needle and just shoved it directly into my lip, like a quarter inch or something, an inch, like way in there. I mean, almost to the point where I got tunnel vision, like someone had knocked me in the head. The note itself kind of double buzzed into this very bizarre, strange double buzz that I've fortunately never actually been able to reproduce. And after that, the rest of the concert, I sort of got through it, but I've noticed I was tired. It was harder to focus my sound, and over the course of several weeks, 8 weeks, I was having more and more trouble, these sort of shocks of pain. And I remember at one point I looked in the mirror, and I had noticed that really there had been a big divot that had developed in my lip. It looked like there was no musculature left underneath there. It was just sort of held together by some skin or something like it. It was a very, very disheartening kind of moment, and that led me down this journey of trying to discover, okay, this type of thing, this partial tear, is something that does happen to brass players. It does not mean that it's going to end your career or end your playing, but it does mean that there are ways that you have to deal with these kinds of things. Now, why is that important is that when I look at the lead up to this injury, I realized that I had gone through a few years, really at that point, of kind of relentless, obsessive practicing and overuse. Very little regard for my own sort of way to treat the musculature and treat it to stress and recovery the way you might if you were an athlete or something like that. And I think that is something that I think about a lot as a teacher. And I've spoken to other people who have been in the industry who have gone through this kind of thing. And very often, it's never usually like out of nowhere. It almost always has its origins in habits of practice that don't allow for sufficient recovery and don't allow for enough time for the muscle to rest and to recover after periods of intensity. So I think that's been something I've been thinking a lot about, is in my own practice these days about how to sort of ride periods of intensity and then to let things heal, intensity and healing and all that kind of stuff.
And how did you handle that mentally, being in positions and jobs that you were very arguably young in your career? How was that?
Yeah, oh boy, in Atlanta that was tough. I can remember where it really hit me is that I left the orchestra. I didn't play for about a year in the orchestra, and like the second week that I was out of the orchestra was when I was supposed to do Mahler 3. It was going to be my first time playing Mahler 3. And I got a ticket to that concert instead, and I listened to my colleague Bill Thomas, who sounded fantastic, but I was, I remember it was on the first balcony, sort of dead center, watching him play, and just realizing it's like, oh my God, am I going to ever get to do this again? And mentally speaking, it was tough. I didn't really have any answers at that point. I didn't have a support system. I didn't know enough, and so the initial was just a massive spike in anxiety. Since I didn't have any work to do anymore, it's also trying to figure out what to do. It's sort of laying on the couch during the day, going, okay, what do I do? I can't practice. I can't play trombone. Everything in this house around me is, the ceiling above my head, the food in the fridge, the cat food in the cat's bowl is there because I played the trombone, and I can't play the trombone, and I don't know if I'm going to get to play the trombone again. So not only anxiety, but having to deal with, that real low point of really sort of dipping down into some kind of depression. And this is a thing that I had never really thought of or considered myself susceptible to, at that point in my life. But I think it really kind of opened up my eyes in the ways that we, as musicians, sometimes so closely associate our own playing with our own self-worth that I had to start down this journey of trying to figure out who I was, not only as a trombonist, but who I was as an individual. So that these days I feel like I'm able to maintain a healthier balance, that obviously I care deeply about what I do, and if I have a concert that doesn't go as well, it's not like it doesn't affect me. It bothers me. But I don't identify it so closely like to my own worth as a person. And if you look around to musicians, music students, all these kinds of things, it's something that I think is very widespread. You sound great, this kind of thing. It's like it's very intensely identified as you as a person and your sound, and this thing that we do. And it's hard if that is very suddenly and, in my case, very almost violently kind of taken away. So I think that this idea that when we are music students and just, as we go through the rest of our career, that we're trying to make sure that we're not just like, trombone heads or, musicians, that we have something else that we're thinking about that we have to offer. That's going to make you a better musician, number one. And secondly, it's going to allow you to have some perspective on what you're doing, and if you're whether you're teaching or playing, to help you to be a better colleague and to appreciate what you do to a much higher degree.
What was that rehabilitation like, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally?
Mm. The mental and emotional part was tough. Coming out of I know auditions that I took before the injury. Um, I'd gotten to the point I wasn't I didn't feel that I was needed to use any beta blockers or anything like that. I had this whole system of ramping up, and it was very very practice intensive. And when I got there, I felt that I practiced so much and I was so prepared that I could play 65% of my whole. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing, but it's like if I can just play 65% and make that 65% competitive, then I'm in good shape. Then I'll be okay. I mean, it's not a really healthy way to approach an audition, but nevertheless, that's one of the things that I did. After the injury, I became so sort of paranoid about my sound and the way things felt, and this inability to really separate this pain and discomfort, because I was in pain for about 8 years probably after the injury. Pretty rough pain for the first 2 years, where it was sort of nonstop. First thing I felt when I woke up, and last thing I felt when I fell asleep. To lesser degrees of it, and then even when I started in the New York Phil, I still had a little bit of that kind of left over. I don't really experience it anymore, but it took me almost a decade to get out of the point where I was getting this pain sensation occasionally, off and on while I was playing. So this kind of sensory input sort of invades your playing. Becomes harder to separate that from the way that you sound. And what I ended up doing is developing a really severe imposter syndrome kind of thing, where I basically was convinced that anything, that I did was probably not good. And it was just a matter of time before I was found out to be a fraud, and that, if people told me I sounded good, it's just because they felt bad for me, and there's, like I was a wounded puppy kind of thing. It's like, a lot of those challenges were there and have been the thing that was hardest for me to put back together when I started taking auditions again for real.
And what was one of the maybe biggest blessings of the injury?
I think the ability to help others, I guess, in a sense, to just put it out there as a story that says, listen, this thing can happen, and it might happen, and you might hear of someone that it happens to, but it doesn't have to be something that ends your career or your enjoyment or your ability to have a life in music or in teaching. That there are ways that you can get around it. Patience has also been something that's come for me out of this one. I'm much more patient and appreciative of being able to do what I do. I feel like I'm much more immune to cynicism than I probably would have been in other circumstances. And cynicism is something that, unfortunately, is somewhat pervasive in the orchestral landscape. It's very easy to become cynical if you're, in the job sometimes. And I feel that I have a good, because I've gone through this, because I know what it's like to not have it. I know what it's like to have it taken away. I value being on the stage more, I think, than I would have had I not gone through it.
What other types of playing do you enjoy doing besides being the symphony?
I've always enjoyed playing like just with small groups of trombone players or trombone choirs, that kind of thing. It's one of the reasons that it started the Southeast Trombone Symposium all those years ago. Was I liked playing in the trombone section in Atlanta. At that time it was George Curran and Bill Thomas, and we liked playing trios. We liked just playing excerpts, and we're like, well, what can we do with this to try to make something that will be cool? Brass quintet also. I think if you find yourself in a situation where you are in a large ensemble doesn't give you a lot of freedom individually to be expressive or to explore your own musical voice. I think that's where a lot of that cynicism comes from. You need to have these smaller groups where you have friends that you play with, you have more freedom, that you have the ability to make your own choices about what you want to play and how you want to play it and where you want to play it. And that's the kind of thing that is I think the only way to survive a career in the orchestra, is to have those kinds of other outlets where you get to explore your own musicianship and your own life as an artist. A large institution like an orchestra will never give you all you need, because you're just a small part of a much larger machine. I mean, it's a great machine. Being a cog in the engine of a Ferrari, it means you're still part of a pretty cool car. but you don't get to make all the decisions about where that car goes and how it's driven. And I think that ability to be the driver instead of just part of the machine is really, really important to keeping your musicianship active, to feeding that sort of musical soul that you need to have that is easy to lose track of. When you're in school, you're just getting all this input, you're getting all this stuff is new for the first time, and it's like super, super, super fresh, and it's amazing. But then you get out there sometimes, and if you're not, and all that's taken away, and you just have the job, it can be a little bit disheartening. You miss it, and you don't even realize that it's gone until a few years later when you realize your playing isn't doing what you want it to do, and you realize you haven't, maybe made a phrase that was truly your own in a long time. That's not the place you want to find yourself. So I think that playing in those small groups where you get to take more, or you're empowered to be more of an artistic leader or more of your own musician is like really important to keeping yourself going.
How do you balance fatherhood and all other facets of your life with playing at a high level?
Do I? I don't know. I'm not so sure. I mean, it's funny you say that because, like this morning, 10 minutes before the recital, I was talking to my wife. My youngest son has like 102.7 fever, and then we're trying to do this whole like passport thing for my older son, and then trying to figure out my dad's gonna come down and help get the babysitter and this, that, and the other, and it's like all this other chaos is happening. I'm down here, and I'm just like, okay, I've got a recital in 10 minutes, so I've got to like somehow like disengage for a second and then come back in. I find that I don't know that there is a good way to balance it. And I will say that early in my kid's life, I couldn't really figure out how to practice enough because it was impossible. The kids needed so much, and I was not going to walk away from that. So the night feedings and the diaper changes and like everything else that needed to happen, I wanted to be there for that, and I still want to be there for that. I feel, anytime I leave town, I definitely have pangs of guilt. I miss my kids. I miss my family. But in terms of trying to balance it, I think I've found time that during the day when they're at school, it's really important for me to, if I can, find some time to work there. I will try to find a session after they go to bed at night. I have to be a little more focused in my practice because I don't have 4 hours to just sort of meander around and play a little bit and then go watch the Netflix and come back and do something like that. I've got to like take care of my business, and I'm finding that the more conscientious I am about what I need to practice, and I have these sort of blocked out time things, that allows me to be more present for my kids when I am with them. And so I can do watching our science videos, I can do the bath time, I can do reading the stories and that kind of stuff, and I love that. So that's the kind of thing that the balance is tough, and honestly it's taken me some time, and I'm still learning, I'm still getting better. I'm sure it'll change as they get older too. There'll be different things that I have to balance, but
What advice do you have for young students on how to be a 21st century musician?
I mean, the landscape is changing so much and so quickly. I mean, just like anything else. I mean, when I was in school, which is a while ago now. I mean, we're talking about what 25 years since I started school or something like that. The technology was it's a completely different animal. I mean, there was social media. I started off with a beeper. I got my first cell phone really to myself, like when I was in college, and it was nothing like today, of course. We were running around with DAT recorders and at one point mini discs and other things like this for our recording equipment. And everything was very dependent on other like outside institutions providing opportunities for you to be discovered. So whether that was competitions, whether that was winning an audition, whether it was something like that, you didn't really have the capacity to self-promote that you have today. And there's a lot of downsides to social media, and you can read any articles and go to any sort of discussion group and you'll hear about it. But one of the positives, in a sense, for musicians is that there is a way for you to have a greater reach, that you don't have to rely on some other institution to open that door for you. And I think that one of the things that's really important for a 21st century musician, especially as you're getting started out, is that I think you do have to learn, if you're not, if you don't have a large institution that's going to do some of that for you, you have to learn how to be proficient in promoting yourself, getting your ideas out there. You have to learn little bit how to use social media. Karen's been on the journey with me about like I was so reluctant to get onto Instagram, and it's I definitely, she was very patient as I sort of turned that corner a little bit. But the more that I look at it, the more that I've been involved with it and seeing what's on there, I realized that most people first got to know me through YouTube and Southeast Trombone Symposium, and then later on, Instagram and some of the things that I've posted there, not just because of the New York Philharmonic or the Atlanta Symphony or something like that. And so I think that I see there are young musicians who are students in schools right now who are kind of, influencers in a way, because they have so many followers, they post a lot of things, and they have people who are interested in what they're doing. It doesn't mean that you have to be like a huge, YouTube streamer or something like that to be successful. But I think the idea is that you can build up some of what you care about on social media. And honestly, the exercise of even deciding what you're going to put up there is going to make you think about what you want to do as a musician, what you have to offer. It'll force you to be creative. It'll force you to explore certain things. And I think if you look at that as an opportunity, yes, it can be a job sometimes too, but it's also an opportunity for you to explore what's important to you and to try to put it out there. I think that's something that is really important. You have to be flexible. Also, I will say that as trombonists, doubling, tenor and bass doubling is basically becoming, for most freelancing, is becoming kind of an imperative. In New York, for instance, if you want to be on Broadway and you're a tenor trombone player, you have to be able to play bass trombone player. If you're a bass trombone player, you basically have to be able to play tuba. It's better for you if you're a tenor trombone player if you can play all three, honestly. There's as the scene has gotten a little tighter, the amount of flexibility that's being required of you has really gone up. So being able to double some more, and don't just pigeonhole yourself into playing, I'm just going to do orchestral excerpts. I think being flexible, knowing how to play in other styles is really, really important. I mean, I can't do what Marshall does. I can't play in that style at all, but I can do an approximate enough to be able to get through like an orchestra pop show. You have to at least be able to do that much. I think you have to be able to play in a Broadway commercial kind of style. You don't have to blow down changes like Marshall necessarily to work in that thing, but you can't be completely ignorant of that style and then expect to make it as a freelancer. So the idea that you have to be kind of an omnivore, both musically and both as a technician in terms of operating instruments, is becoming more and more just a necessity in today's world. And the days of being able to be a hyper specialist, like a second trombonist kind of thing, are increasingly rare.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
Hello.
What advice would you give to a undergrad musician who's planning on auditioning and going to grad school?
So, when it comes to who you're going to study with, I mean, I think first of all, try to reach out and try to find a way. Whether these days it's nice because we've all learned how to get onto Zoom. Maybe that's the one silver lining from having lived through COVID, is that's become increasingly easier. I think it's really important for to not go completely blind into who you're going to study with just based on reputation. Just like any personal interpersonal relationship, you might not click with a particular teacher even if they have a great reputation. So I think it's important, number one, to try to reach out, to try to at least talk to them, to try to talk a little bit about their how they like to teach, and to understand a little bit about what you might be getting into if you're going to go do some master's work. The next thing is I think you want to kind of look at the schools in terms of what they have to offer, both at the school but also in the surrounding area. I think I personally, I went to school in New York not only because I wanted to, study with members of the New York Phil back in the day, but I also wanted to be in a place that had a lot going on. I wanted to learn a little bit about opera. I wanted to learn about what symphonies were coming through Carnegie. I wanted to be able to go down to the Village Vanguard and hear a real combo for the first time in my life. It kind of blew my mind, like what music making was like in that setting. I think that's an important thing. And I also think that for a grad student, you have to balance all of those opportunities versus the cost. A music degree is not necessarily like a law degree or a medical degree. It doesn't necessarily entitle you or make it that much easier for you to get work. And so I always try to make sure that I tell students, let's say it's a choice between me at Manhattan School of Music or somewhere else. If they're getting a full ride to this other place, I'll say, listen, save your money and take some lessons with me, but don't incur, too much debt. That debt will make it so that you can't be as flexible with freelance work when you get out. You may have to take a job that will help you to have enough money to be able to pay for your student loans, which might diminish your ability to have opportunities to get into the freelance scene and really delay your ability to be like a working musician. So I think that the finding ways to get your education with a minimum amount of debt is also an important consideration. And I say this as someone who doesn't have a degree. I left school early. A degree is not necessarily a guarantee of employment. What you really need to be looking at is, are you in a place where you are getting close to the best of possible training that you can get, and you have access to the best training that you can get in a way that won't weigh you down like a lodestone later on in your life.
Anybody else?
What kind of advice would you give to a freshman in high school wanting to be like you?
This is actually, I'm having like a very huge deja vu, because I remember being a freshman in high school and asking a very similar question to someone who is up on a stage in my youth orchestra who was holding a day like this. I think as a freshman in high school, I'll tell you what my personal journey was to get to this point where I wanted to try making it in music, because I had a lot of interests. I was extremely interested in science. I was extremely interested in language and history and logic. So I had these two sort of competing ideas that, on one hand, I loved the idea of being a doctor or somewhere in the medical field. I also had a notion that I might be a good lawyer, but I remember I think it was my sophomore year of high school. We were playing in youth orchestra, and I loved going to youth orchestra every weekend. And I realized that, every Monday I was already thinking about what next Sunday was going to be like, and to be able to get there. And the people who were in the orchestra were really like, they become my close friends, my support system. And so I kind of made this thought to myself, which is that, I had this notion, like, I did not want to be the age I am now, say 45, 46 years old, and look back from, out the window of my corporate office or something like that, and be a little bit burned out on my job, and wished that I at least had seen what could have been. And so I decided to sort of take that journey at that point. So I sort of pursued it, and I sort of made a deal with myself that if I think of I had a very arbitrary age or something like that. If I'm 28 years old and I can't really support myself through trombone, I will have had enough education that I could go back and get a degree and do something else. And I've seen lots of people go down this road, where they've been extraordinarily successful in other things too. And I think but they're still musicians, which is the thing I find really amazing, is that, there's a guy I know who's a really high-end lawyer down in San Diego, who's a fantastic trumpet player, and he posts about his law degree stuff, but it's mostly about trumpet. I have another friend of mine who is a fantastic trombonist who got a job doing like international relations work, going to and from like Seattle to China, and got into like there's so many people, even in where my mom, who was a scientist where she worked, who were musicians who went on to do other things and still played and still had music as part of their life, even though they were doing these other things. So bringing it back to what I would say for a freshman, in high school, is to just be open to all of your interests and follow them where they may go, and if you find, like I did, that at a certain point, like, junior year or something like that, that you really can't see yourself doing anything else without that instrument in your hand, then I think you probably owe it to yourself to see what you can do with it, And you have to approach it knowing that there's no guarantees in life. This can be for any degree. I mean, geez, lawyers, and they're looking at the way that AI is now automating certain things that used to give employment to a lot of like young lawyers and that kind of thing. I mean, it's every industry is grappling with this to some degree. But I think if you follow that passion, but don't necessarily leave yourself closed off from other ideas for a while, because you're still very young. I know it doesn't feel like it, but you are. And at some point you might have that sort of epiphany that you realize that like that is it. I mean, for me it was like that vision of me in that office, but it was also the fact that I just I had to go into the basement and practice a couple hours a day because I just loved it, you know. And if you find that you're that person, then the other thing you need to do, I think, when you're that young, is seek out the very best training you can at you know, and find out who's in your area, who's you know, very experienced, you know, really good teacher. Look at stuff like there's a million different resources online. You know, be really curious, you know, about what's out there. Maybe reach out to some folks and take some Zoom lessons, that kind of thing. Try to do the best that you can to increase your knowledge and your experience, so that you don't have such a narrow view of what it is that you're trying to go after. That you start to understand the complexity and the very many ways that you can make a way of living in music, you know, that's out there. So I wish there was a step-by-step checklist, but I think really you have to be open to a lot of different possibilities. But that at the same time, if you know that this is something you want, you have to be a little bit of a maximalist about going out and finding those opportunities to learn and to train.
Anybody else?
Just a quick question about your injury. When it happened, did you search out much professional help? Did you get many opinions, or did you even have surgery? Or
Fortunately, I didn't have surgery. Although the doctor that I was seeing wanted to do surgery. I had seen pictures of surgery at that point. And so I went to get a second and a third opinion, and eventually decided not to. And I feel good about that decision. But the amount of knowledge that was out there was very small. I only found one person who had any like appreciable accumulation of knowledge about this one that was easy to access, and that was someone named Lucinda Lewis. And she had the website embouchures.com, and I got in touch with her, and she is someone who has played principal horn in the New Jersey Symphony, who had a partial tear and had a lot of methods that she had used and developed to sort of deal with it. But also talking to her, she had, more importantly for me even than just the specific things, was knowing that she had spoken to, she said by the time I'd spoken to her, you know, more than 1,000 brass players who had had something like this happen, you know, that she had spoken to over the years. So she had been open about it for a long time, and people had sort of sought her out. And that she eventually also, I found someone named Lori Frink, you know, who unfortunately passed away, but she was also incredibly influential in helping me. And I think knowing that there was finding those people who had the experience with dealing with injured players, and knowing that there was a possibility for rehabilitation and a positive outcome was enormously helpful for me. And it's one of the reasons I decided to be more open about what had happened to me, is so that other people would see that it isn't impossible to recover from it. You know, it's not easy, but it's also not impossible. And it doesn't mean that even while you're recovering that you can't have really great musical and meaningful musical experiences and be able to support yourself with your instrument. So yeah, I did find professional help. I did find good medical help. And now the medical help, actually, as I understand, has gotten even better. They during the time that I was injured, MRIs were not sensitive enough to be able to image the musculature. So the only way they had it was clinical palpation, you know, put on a glove and feel the lip. Now apparently they have MRIs that are becoming sensitive enough that they can actually visualize the lip musculature, and you can make a better diagnosis that way. I've talked to someone who had this done in Germany, and I've been told that they might be getting this kind of stuff over here soon too.
and since I have the mic, I'm going to ask a second question just to save this guy a trip. Personally, you've been playing in orchestras for you've probably cycled through Tchaikovsky a few times. I'm wondering if you have any bucket list pieces that you still have not played.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's Mahler 3 is basically the top of that list for me. There's very few. You know, it's funny. I've played most everything else that I really want to play. You know, and I feel very lucky to be able to say that. You know, but yeah, that is very, very high on my list of bucket list items. I think it's probably the top for me. If I do that one time, I'll be happy. I'll feel like, even if I put the horn down tomorrow, that I will have gotten what I wanted out of it from the orchestra anyway.
Awesome. We have time for one more.
During your time, did you ever find respect for any other instruments, or wanted to try and play a different instrument in all your years of playing?
Yeah, I am always amazed by people who can really do multiple instruments. I've gotten to do multiple instruments as long as they have basically the same mouthpiece. So alto trombone, bass trumpet, euphonium, bass trombone, tenor trombone. And I even had to play contra one time, which is really blew my mind because I was terrible at it, and yet I still had to get through this little thing. So I think that for me in my life, I only had enough time and energy to highly specialize in one sort of family of instruments in that way. But I have a student who's a fantastic guitar player, and I love what that does for him in terms of the way that he thinks. And I always imagine that when I see people who are actually really proficient, I really wish I played piano, to be honest with you. I wish I had stuck with those lessons when I was younger. 'Cause I think that being able to play piano especially was really, really helpful just in terms of being able to develop your ear, to be able to sort of visualize, harmonies and harmonic language and that kind of thing. So, I mean, if I had one extra instrument that I could play, I would love to be able to play piano. That would be the thing. But I think that for me, to get to where I needed to be and to maintain the level I needed to be at, I only had enough energy and wherewithal to be a maximalist in that one family of instruments.
Awesome. Thank y'all for being here, and thanks, Colin, for sharing.